The sun cast golden streaks across the Manhattan skyline, painting the city in the colors of ambition and success. Joseph F. "Chip" Scowron III stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his high-rise apartment, sipping a glass of expensive Bordeaux. He wasn't just a doctor. He wasn't just a hedge fund manager. He was both, a rare breed of intellect and financial prowess that Wall Street both feared and admired. From Harvard Medical School to the world of high-stakes investments, his journey had been a meteoric rise. He had left behind the operating room for something even more lucrative, the power to shape fortunes, to turn millions into billions with a simple flick of his hand. At Front Point Partners, a hedge fund backed by Morgan Stanley, he controlled millions of dollars in healthcare investments. Pharmaceutical stocks moved at his command. The medical world was a complex game of risks and rewards, and Chip had mastered it. His insider knowledge of medicine gave him an edge over Wall Street's sharpest minds. He had built an empire, yet behind the elegant suits and flawless confidence, there was something else, a secret, a whisper of something not quite right. That evening, as he leaned back in his leather chair, scrolling through his portfolio, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Dr. Yves Benamou, a trusted contact, a medical insider. Chip smirked and picked up the call. "Tell me something good," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. There was a pause. Then Dr. Benamou's voice, hesitant, cautious. "Chip, there's something you need to know." Outside, the city lights flickered like stars, but in that moment, the world inside Chip Scowron's penthouse darkened just a little. Chip leaned forward, pressing the phone closer to his ear. The hesitation in Dr. Yves Benamou's voice was unusual. Benamou was always precise, always controlled. He was a brilliant physician, an expert in clinical trials, and more importantly, someone with knowledge worth millions. "Chip," Benamou said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "The trial. It's not going well." For a second, silence filled the space between them. Chip's fingers tightened around his wine glass. Human Genome Sciences Incorporated, HGSI, had a revolutionary new drug in development, one that could change the game for autoimmune diseases. Front Point had invested millions based on promising early results. The market was expecting a breakthrough. Now, Benamou was saying otherwise. "What do you mean, not going well?" Chip's voice was calm, but his heart had already picked up speed. "There are complications. The test group is showing dangerous side effects. I can't say for sure, but the FDA could reject it." A single sentence, but its weight was crushing. If the news went public, HGSI's stock price would plummet. Investors would flee. Front Point, his fund, would lose millions. Chip closed his eyes, forcing his thoughts into order. There was still time. The news hadn't reached the market yet. He could act before anyone else. He could pull out before the disaster struck. He opened his eyes, already formulating a plan. "You're sure about this?" Chip asked, his voice dangerously low. Benamou hesitated again. Yes, but Chip, you didn't hear this from me. If anyone—" I know," Chip interrupted, his mind already racing ahead. "Leave it to me." He ended the call and exhaled, staring out over the city. The lights still twinkled below him, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. A decision had to be made, a calculated decision. With a deep breath, he reached for his laptop. There was still time to get ahead of this, still time to stay on top. Chip stared at the glowing screen of his laptop, the stock market ticking in real time. The numbers on Human Genome Sciences, Inc., HGSI, were steady for now, but that wouldn't last. The moment news of the failed trials became public, those numbers would collapse like a house of cards. This was the moment, the kind that made or broke careers. He could do what any other investor would, wait, hope, and suffer the consequences. Or he could act now, quietly, swiftly, before the rest of the world found out. Chip's fingers hovered over his keyboard. The financial world had rules, but in the end, it was a battlefield, and in a war, you did what you had to do to survive. He took a deep breath and started typing. Sell. Front Point had millions invested in HGSI, but Chip couldn't just dump everything at once. That would raise red flags. He needed to be strategic, reduce exposure in increments, make it look like routine adjustments. His mind was sharp, calculating, a doctor in finance, diagnosing and treating risk before it became fatal. Minutes passed, then hours. By the end of the trading day, Front Point had quietly offloaded millions in HGSI shares. The fund had just dodged what could have been a catastrophic loss. And no one suspected a thing. As the markets closed, Chip leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This was how the game was played. The right information at the right time. That was the difference between winning and losing. His phone vibrated, a message from Benamou. Did you do something? Chip smirked. Don't worry about it. He set his phone down and took a long sip of wine. He had made his move. Now it was just a matter of waiting. What could go wrong? Days passed, then weeks. Chip had moved fast, reducing Front Point's exposure just in time. When news of the failed drug trials finally broke, HGSI's stock plunged. Investors panicked. Millions were lost by others, but not by Chip. He watched from his office, sipping coffee, as news anchors dissected the market reaction. A brutal day for biotech stocks, one of them said. Many funds took heavy losses, except for a few who saw the signs early. A satisfied smirk played at the corners of his lips. He had played it perfectly. Then his office phone rang. "Chip," a voice on the other end said, too serious, too heavy. It was one of Front Point's legal advisors. "There's something you should know." Chip's fingers tensed. "What is it?" "The SEC just opened an investigation into trading activity around HGSI. His heart skipped a beat. And they're looking at hedge funds that reduced their holdings before the stock crashed. Your name is on the list." For the first time in years, Chip felt cold. "Relax," he said smoothly. "It was a smart call. We adjusted based on market trends, not insider information." There was a pause. "You should be careful, Chip." The voice was lower now. "They're talking to people. They're going to dig." Chip swallowed, his mind racing. He had been careful. No emails, no texts. Just a phone call with Benamou, who wouldn't say anything. Would he? The thought sat like a lead weight in his stomach. The glass walls of his office suddenly felt like a cage. Chip exhaled and forced a chuckle. Let them look. They won't find anything. But deep down, for the first time, a crack had formed in his perfect world, and cracks had a way of spreading. Chip sat in his high-rise office, hands steepled under his chin, calculating. The SEC investigation had cast a long shadow, but he had handled pressure before. He wasn't some reckless amateur who left breadcrumbs. He had covered his tracks. Then it happened. A headline flashed across his screen. "Insider Trading Probe, Government Witness Comes Forward." His stomach twisted. He clicked on the article, his eyes scanning furiously. Then he saw it. Dr. Eve Benamou was cooperating with federal investigators. Chip's pulse pounded in his ears. Benamou had been arrested months earlier on unrelated fraud charges. That much he had heard through whispers in the finance world. But what Chip hadn't considered, what he should have seen coming, was that Benamou would cut a deal. To save himself, he had given up Chip. The phone in his office rang. He ignored it. His fingers were cold against his laptop keyboard. His mind raced. What had Benamou told them? The medical trials, the conversations, the casual tip about the drug's failure. They must have everything. His chest tightened. He knew how this worked. The feds didn't move unless they had something solid. For the first time, Chip saw the walls closing in. His phone buzzed again. A text this time, from his lawyer. "Call me. Now." Chip closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was an onslaught. Chip's hand hovered over his phone, his lawyer's urgent message burning on the screen. He knew what this meant. The game was over. Still, he clung to the last threads of control, dialing the number with steady fingers. The line clicked. "Chip," his lawyer's voice was sharp, "they're coming for you." The words punched the air from his lungs. "The SEC and the FBI are moving forward. Benamou gave them everything. He recorded conversations, handed over evidence, emails, call logs, even your trades. They have you on insider trading, fraud, and obstruction. You need to prepare for—" A sharp knock at his office door cut the lawyer's words short. Chip's blood ran cold. Then a second knock, louder, more forceful. They were here. The door swung open. 2 men in dark suits entered. The lead agent flashed his badge. "Joseph Scowron, you are under arrest." The room spun as the words echoed in his skull. His empire, his fortune, his reputation, all of it crumbled in an instant. They pulled his hands behind his back, the cold metal of handcuffs locking around his wrists. As they led him through the office, past stunned colleagues, past whispers and stares, Chip kept his head high. On Wall Street, he had always played to win. But now he was the cautionary tale, the doctor who thought he was untouchable, the man who flew too close to the sun and burned. Chip was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Morgan Stanley, furious at the scandal, sued him under the faithless servant doctrine, demanding every dollar he earned during his crimes. The court ruled against him. He was ordered to repay $31 million. His wealth gone, his career destroyed, his legacy forever tainted. And as he sat in a cold prison cell staring at the gray concrete walls, he realized the biggest gamble he ever took wasn't in the stock market. It was believing he wouldn't get caught. And he lost.